Okay, so philosophers today, when they consider the concept of God, and they consider whether God exists, that's of course one of the main questions, does God exist, typically have something very specific in mind. And I've got kind of a basic definition for you on the board. They're talking about a being, put that in quotation marks, we'll talk about why being may or may not be a good term, but who's omniscient, that is, he knows all things. Who's omnipotent, that is, he's all powerful. That is perfect and good, perfectly good. I mean, Plato will in fact refer to this deity as the good. And this is kind of a base definition that when philosophers ask, oh, is there a God or isn't there a God, that they're typically asking. They typically assume this definition of God, and then they move forward. What we're going to see, especially in the passages that you read for today, is that there's more to the Hebrew God than this. There are more characterizations of the Hebrew God, and I think it's going to be significant in terms of how we differentiate what it is the Hebrew God is in comparison with the gods of the region at the time, but also the gods God that Christians are are kind of comparing their God to at the time of the birth of after the birth of Christ. Okay, so there are going to be 4 questions that are going to be particularly important throughout this course, and 4 questions that are really raised in the scriptures, in the passages I had you read for today. And these questions are, what is God? What is nature? What is human nature? And what is good and evil? What's interesting is even modern philosophers who look to reason have in the past looked to the scriptures as a place to philosophize about these ideas. For example, Kant looks to the fall of Adam and Eve as a place to meditate upon the nature of evil. So the texts and the meditation upon texts and stories is a traditional way of understanding and thinking about philosophy. And especially when we're talking about ancient and Christian philosophy, these questions are central. Even this question, who or what is God? That's going to be central to understanding what is nature, what is human nature, what is good and evil. And the thing that's going to characterize the Hebrew Bible and kind of general Hebrew conceptions of the Bible are going to be 3 major manifestations within the Hebrew Scriptures, particularly the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy. These are going to be the central texts that for the Hebrew religion, even more than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And these 3 events, manifestations I want us to discuss today, are ways in which reveal who the Hebrew God is. Now, when you're going to answer questions like this, you're going to look. There are only 3 sources that you can look to try to answer questions like this: reason, experience, authority. Now, the Hebrew Bible, the scriptures, are, depending upon how you look at them, a source of authority, or at least a source of experience, or an experience that is created by the numbers of communities who have read these scriptures over time. But let's look at the first one I want us to consider is creation and fall in Genesis 1 through 3. Now, there are a lot of questions we could ask about Genesis 1 through 3. Modern discussions tend to relate around questions like, was it really all done in 7 days? Was it really all done in 1 day? And of course, is there a God? But that's not exactly what I want us to talk today about. Now, if you're interested in this question of 7 days and versus 1 day, I would encourage you to look at Augustine, who actually has a very interesting theory of how it was all created in one day, and the 7 days correspond to that in a very specific way. But that's just a teaser, and I'm going to deal with that today. But what I want us to think about with the creation and fall is, how do we answer these questions when we look at that particular text? So what do we find in Genesis 1 through 3? Well, in the chapter 1, in Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The first thing you should notice there, the first thing that exists and is being, is God. And all other things, whether they're the heavens or the earth, are understood to have been created by God. That tells us something both about nature and about God. It tells us that God is the fundamental being. Sometimes philosophers will make the distinction between being and created being, or being beyond being and just being. And so this kind of God that the Hebrews are talking about is a creator God. A creator God who, and as we see, as Genesis 1 unfolds, has created every category of being imaginable. Whether you think of it as 6 days or 1 day, what is significant about the days, and what I want you to get from each of those days, he creates light and dark, he separates the earth from the sky, is that this creator God is responsible not only for the creation of the world, but for the formation of the world. This will be significant because in certain other philosophies, Platonism is one of them, there's going to be a distinction between the God who maybe upon which all things subsist and from which all things flow, and the God that forms all things. But in Genesis 1 through 6, we see a kind of formation. We see a wisdom, oftentimes that passage is associated with Proverbs and wisdom creating the world. This God creating all things in his wisdom and thus forming and making things have nature. And in comparison with the nature, the gods and the traditions that were surrounding the Hebrew people when this book was written, this is a God who creates all things. This isn't a God, like, it's not as if there's a sun God, or there's a earth God, or there's a God of this particular place, or or animals, or anything. This is a God who creates all things. This is a God upon which all things depend, and who forms all things, and whose mind dreams up and makes happen all things. This is the kind of, and with each of these successive creations, we have a repetition of a term. And he created this, the evening and the morning was the first day, second day, and it was good. And it was good. This kind of affirmation of goodness tells us something about created nature. That this kind of and the kind of God that's creating all things is a good God, perfectly good, and thus he creates all things so that they are good. But there's one, when you get to Genesis 2, and the story is retold, focusing upon the creation of man and woman, there is an introduction of another phrase. It was not good. So we have this, it was good, it was good, it was good. And then God saw that it was not good for man to be alone. We have here the beginning of a way of thinking about the distinction between good and evil. Maybe not even good and evil, but just good and not good. In that it wasn't as if God made Adam and somehow there was a manufacturing flaw. It was that Adam without Eve was imperfect. He was incomplete. So we have first this understanding of there are things that are good because they're complete, and there are things that are not good because they're incomplete and imperfect. Okay. So that this this creation, you've got a certain understanding of God as creator, God as good, nature as good fundamentally, and then we have in both two places, in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, an introduction to human nature. Now we could spend a lot of time thinking about what Genesis 1 and 2 tell us, and 3 tell us about human nature. But I want to highlight a few things right off the bat. Genesis 1, when Adam and Eve are created on the sixth day, that's the same day that all the other animals were created, and thus, in some sense, in a similar category with the animals. God creates and God created man. In the image and likeness, He created in His image and likeness, male and female, He created them. There's something about both the male and the female that is made in the image and likeness of God. Now and so in Genesis 1, we have an introduction to probably one of the most fundamental categories of what human nature is within the Hebrew context, which is that human nature is almost, he's using language that you would expect of a divine king. And I say that, it might be divine king, at the time, when this work was written, a lot of kings described themselves as being in the image and likeness of the deity. Image isn't just a word that is like synonym with likeness. Image is like you might have a statue that an emperor sends across the world and globe so that people know that this is kind of a representative of him. And it's like him, but when it's a king, it's someone who rules on behalf of this deity. So within this culture, the idea is that kings rule, they're supposed to be like God, and they're supposed to be respected like God, and they're supposed to be like God. Now, how are they like God? Now, that is going to be a really big question. There are going to be some answers to that, but we're not going to be able to deal with all of them today. One of the ways in which people have thought about them being like God is speech. They are, of course, there's going to be problems with that because the snake theoretically spoke, but they're speaking, they're rational. There's something about their rationality, there's something about their speech, possibly something about their ability to judge between good and evil, but we'll discuss that. There's something about human beings that in their created state is supposed to be like God and is supposed to represent God and His rule on earth in a good way. But when we get to Genesis 2, we start to see an examination of human nature in a more distinct form, which is going to be the distinction between the male and the female. Now, in some ways, the Hebrew Bible is really unique in dealing with this concept early. A lot of it wasn't until about the 17th century that even Platonists started to try to think, I'm being. But the distinction, and so the philosophers trying to think about the difference between what it is to be male nature and female nature is a difficult concept. It's not as frequently explored in ancient thought, but it is explored in Genesis 3. What do we find? We find a tale in which Adam is created from the ground. He's created, and we can see this, take this literally in the sense of he's dust from dust, ashes from ashes, but he's created from the stuff that's one of the most humble things in the universe. You might even see him created as an animal, but then he is endowed from on high with this likeness and with this mission to represent God. So man's kind of a half-breed. But man is apparently not complete without woman. And this introduction of the creation of Eve from Adam's side, certain philosophers, Hugh of St. Victor is a good example of this, describe this as he's being made from, she's being made from Adam's side. She's being made from the same substance. Some Christian interpreters will even say that she has the same exact substance as Adam, in the same way that the Father and the Son and the Trinity are made of the same substance. And in the same way, or a very similar way, not exactly the same, because there's duality there, but definitely in the same way that, if you're familiar with the story of the loaves and the fishes, Jesus makes many fish and many loaves of bread out of one. So there's an establishment of priority, Adam before Eve, but also of equality of one being made from the substance of the other. Now there are a lot of questions. There are a lot of ways of interpreting what is happening here, what is the male-female relationship. What I want to tag for you is that in this particular passage, we have a meditation upon the relationship between male nature and female nature. And that they have a certain unity, they have a certain complementarity, and they have a certain relationship that is essential to what it means to be human. But then, in Genesis 3, right, we have the fall. I won't go into huge details about this, but what I want to emphasize to you is what we learn about the nature of evil from the fall, right? In the fall, you've got God who's given Adam a command. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And somehow, whether Eve heard it directly or she heard it from Adam, Eve is by herself or maybe just talking to herself, and she sees this tree and some sort of snake talks to her, and the Satan is not, who knows, but he's a talking snake. And has God really said that you shall not eat of the tree of the garden, of all of the trees of the garden? And there's this back and forth, but well, no, we're allowed to eat all of them, just not the one. And at a certain point, she looks at it, she sees it within her own mind, it looks like it's good for food. Why? And the serpent says, well, why would God keep such a, he doesn't want you to become like him, right? He doesn't want you to become like him. That's the only reason why he's told you to do that. And she looks at it and she decides herself and she eats of the fruits. And she gives it to Adam. Now there are all sorts of questions that rise from such a sparse narrative like this. In some ways it's ripe for philosophical speculation because there are so few details. But what I want to highlight for you is that evil at the beginning is coming from a created source, the snake. Now why is the snake intent upon temptation? Who knows? But this is not upon it. You have certain religions, if you've read Nietzsche's Zoroastrianism or Manichaeism, if you've read Augustine, that are going to have this duality, right? There's a good God and there's a bad God. This is not what we're finding in this Genesis account. What we're finding in this Genesis account is a created creature that is subverting God's will, and then another created creature, Adam and Eve, who are also avoiding God's will. And thus we have a concept, so we have that concept of not good, that is imperfect, which is not necessarily a good God. You can imagine a God creating things that are not good because they're imperfect. You have the concept that evil's source is still coming from created things, and that it has to do with wills. You have a human will that is disobedient to a divine will. And you might even argue that you have a human will that is operating according to knowledge based upon its sight and what it can understand, versus divine sight and what the divine understands overall. And thus the human trying to grasp that which is not supposed to happen. That which is, maybe it would have been, there are all sorts of speculation. Maybe the tree of the knowledge of good and evil would have been given to them eventually. But the fact of the matter remains, they're to disobey command. And thus, evil is the thwarting of a created will against the commands and against the intentions of the uncreated will. We have this manifestation and this interesting thing. But then, and creation and fall really is one of the key areas. If you go and look throughout ancient and medieval philosophy, oftentimes if you look for commentary on Genesis, you'll find a lot of philosophy. Especially Genesis 1 through 3. The next manifestation I want to highlight for you, though, is Abraham's call. Abraham's call is not going to be if you can imagine, the God who we see in Genesis was initially dealing with only 2 human beings, but then he's dealing with all of humanity. And to a certain extent, you would think, well, this God is all-powerful and all-knowing. Why can't he deal with all of humanity? And yet there's a sense in which it's not the problem. The problem isn't with, but his attempts to deal with all of humanity through the Tower of Babel or whatever, Noah's Ark, all of these things. If you don't know these, you should read them, but we're not going to deal with them. They fail not because God is insufficient, but because mankind seems to need specific revelation. And so God, all of mankind seems to be almost in rebellion at this point in time. And Abraham is living in a place called Ur of Chaldees. This brings us back to the Magi. Ur of Chaldees is known in the ancient world for its astronomy. Ur of Chaldees is known for its culture. It's also known for its paganism, by which I mean lots and lots and lots of different types of deities for everything. Now, we will never know, there's lots of speculation, why one man would leave a really cosmopolitan town and go to what is essentially the sticks. Not much, think about it. That whole area of the Canaan land is not civilized in the sense that civilization comes from the word city. You don't have a lot of them in Canaan. But we have this tale of Abraham being called away from civilization to trust a God who has promised him something. He's promised him 3 things. He's promised him offspring, like the sands of the seas. And this is going to be interesting because he's going to wait a long, long time for offspring. He's promised him so many offspring that eventually his descendants will be like innumerable. He's promised him land. And he's promised him blessing. And what's interesting is he's promised him blessing not for just him and his descendants, but for the entire world. What do we see about this Hebrew God in comparison with the gods that people are familiar with at the time? Well, for one, a lot of those gods were associated with places, with specific things. This is a God, and if you read Genesis especially, this is a God who's associated with relationship. This is not in this definition right here, but if you've heard, especially evangelical Christians, but Christians in general say, our God is a personal God. What is a person? This is going to relate to when people talk about issues of abortion. What is a person? A person in the Latin, persona, is basically a face that allows people to have communication and relationship. Persons relate to one another. The idea is that the Hebrew God has an ability and does relate to individual human beings. And he picks out some, especially in the book of Genesis. Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob. These are going to be, this concept of person, this relational God is the nature of the Hebrew God. And I want us to fast forward a lot of years later, to Moses, when the descendants of Abraham are innumerable. One might even say more than the sand of the sea, hyperbolically. And they're in Egypt, and they're in slavery. And Moses, who was saved through all sorts of events that you should read about, finds himself in the wilderness, married to a guy who may or may not even be Hebrew, married to a guy's daughter. Not married to a guy, married to a guy's daughter, who's a shepherdess, and he's a shepherd, and he's out in the middle of the wilderness taking care of his sheep when he sees a sight. He sees a bush burning, but not being consumed. It's not being burnt up. What on earth is that? Shepherd's never seen this before, so he kind of goes up and, okay, what is this? And then he has this voice, take off your shoes, this is holy ground. We have this concept, holiness, right? What's holiness? Holiness is this separation. It's this separation between that is almost scary. We have a God who one has to approach with a certain amount of reverence, a certain amount of fear, a certain amount of purity, as the shoes taking off. And God apparently speaks to Abraham through a voice in this bush. And what does he say? I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The first thing, his identifying feature, as I pointed out to you before, is relationship. A relationship with a specific people. What's going on? And Moses, and he says that he has heard the plight of the Hebrew people. He's heard that they're in slavery, and he's going to free them. And he's going to use Moses to free them. But you have Moses, who we don't understand why maybe he had a speech impediment, or maybe he just didn't like to talk in front of people. It's like, what do I tell these people if I say God spoke to them? I don't even know if I want to speak on behalf of them. And this God says, who shall I say is coming to them? Now, the God of their fathers, a God of relationship, but then there's a revealed name. And this revealed name will become important in Hebrew culture. It's Yahweh. We say a lot of things about this name. Sometimes through a certain kind of misunderstanding that has a great etymology that I won't go through, it's called Jehovah in English. It's false etymology, but that's okay. And often, if you're reading certain Bibles, you will see the word Lord, Adonai in Hebrew, and Lord is going to have this is called small caps, uppercase cap, small caps. And what happened is this became the holy name for the God of Israel, Yahweh. Rabbis didn't say this when they came across this in a manuscript. They'd see Adonai written up above there, and instead of saying Yahweh, they would say Adonai. And thus, the English tradition of just inserting Lord in small caps, if you just see Lord regularly, that's probably Adonai. Lord in small caps to represent this name. Now, what does this name mean? It's a really interesting. In English, we have it translated as I am. And in Greek, it's kind of translated as I am too. And thus we have this kind of concept of God as being that will become so problematic and so much discussed in Christian philosophy and beyond. But this word in Hebrew has a meaning that goes beyond being. It's a special kind of verb, a special kind of infinitive that has within it the idea of cause. It's causative. I mean, can you imagine having a language where you could say both an infinitive and have it be a causative sort of thing? So this is the being that causes being, right? That's what this name reveals. This name, this holy name, is revealing kind of a fundamental nature of the divine, which is going to be what is God? This is a God who is the foundation of all things, who creates all things. This isn't just some local God. This isn't just some God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, though he is that. This is God. Fast forward a little bit. in the story to where Moses has actually talked to people. He's bringing them out of Egypt. There's the whole, going through the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army is getting smashed. Read it, it's kind of fun. But when he gets there, they get to Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, sometimes called, and the people of Israel, God calls the people of Israel to go up. The people of Israel have learned, they're scared. This is a God that is freaking scared. You don't want to cross him, and nobody wants to go up to the mountain to talk to him. So Moses, you go. You go on our behalf, and we don't want to deal with this, right? And so God gives Moses on this mountaintop 10 commandments. And oftentimes within the Hebrew, so I told you that the first 5 books of the Bible are kind of central to the Hebrew scriptures. They're like the scriptures of the scriptures. The 10 commandments are the kind of commands of the Torah. And underneath those is the Shema, which you can kind of divide the 10 commandments into, which is love God, love your neighbor. You can divide the 5 commandments, 5 and 5. Love God, love your neighbor. So we see, and I should actually talk about this with Abraham, we have a God who's interested in the deeds and the relationship of human beings, and who sees morality and sees life and goodness from the human perspective as those who have the proper ordering of loves. You love God, you love your neighbor. And you don't just love him kind of in an obvious, you love him in a way that you don't worship other gods. I mean, we kind of have this concept of monotheism that there is only one God. There could be lots of other demons or angels or whatever you want to call them, but you only worship one God. And you keep this God first, you love this God first, and then you love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus will also, when he says, when the rabbis ask, can you sum up the law, and he talks about love God, love your neighbor, he's following within a tradition of the rabbis which says, that's the heart of the law. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one, and you shall love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the law. So this is a God that gives a law that has at its root love. This is a God that gives a law that has at its root love. And he expects to be obeyed. And he makes covenants with people. He doesn't just have relationships with people. Some covenants are unconditional. He promised Abraham certain things. Some covenants are conditional. Circumcision. If you circumcise your people, I will bless you. And you will enter into this kind of law relationship. This is a God of covenant, of relationship, of law, of love. Make sure that I haven't forgotten anything. And this is a God, and then we have, at a certain point in time, the Hebrew people hear this. While Moses is up on the mountain getting this law, what are the Hebrew people doing down below? They go to Moses' brother, Aaron, and they say, we don't know what's happened to Moses, your brother, but we kind of like to have idols to worship. And some biblical scholar, and he makes these golden calves. And we have kind of examples that we think might have. And biblical scholars have said, Aaron may not have been completely given to idolatry, because sometimes in deities, in the ancient Near East, you'd have a calf, and then you'd have the deity riding on top of the calf. And the fact that he only made a calf and not a deity riding on top of the calf is kind of symbolic of the fact that Aaron knew that this God was not seen. This God was not an idol like the other gods. You may say that, but even if you say that, it's clear that having an idol and worshiping before this particular thing was not okay. And when Moses comes down, he's upset. He's so upset that these stone tablets theoretically written in the very hand of God, are broken. And Moses ends up having to go back up the mountain and getting to make his own stone tablets again and getting these commandments again. And it's at this point we have the Hebrew God revealing himself with two attributes. So this is kind of, these attributes are things like omniscience, omnipotence, goodness. But we have him giving, they're adjectives, but we have him giving a particular, two attributes that he considers to be fundamental to who he is. He is merciful and he is just. Now this is also not in the philosopher's God, right? Justice might be, in the sense that you might understand truth, justice to be acting and having a will that's in accordance with truth. So the idea of justice, and I think Plato might argue this, the idea of justice is inherent within the idea of truth and of goodness, but merciful? Not so much. So I want to read this to you. This God of Abraham reveals himself to Moses. And Moses, by the way, because he's had this ability to talk to God face to face, himself has changed. And this says something, too, about the relationship between God and man, because God, this kind of God changes people when they have a relationship with him. And this Moses, who had one of the closer relationships with him, had to put a veil over his face, because his face shone so much that people got afraid. They were scared of him, right? Because he had Shekinah glory shining out of him. This is also, by the way, a mistranslation. Jerome translates this as horns. And now he has, horns to represent power, but if you've seen, I'm a Notre Dame fan. Don't ask me about the national championships. I don't talk about it. However, we have this statue we call Touchdown Moses, and he has horns, right? And this is kind of going to the Latin tradition of the translation of the Bible. It says he has horns. Well, no, he doesn't have horns. He's got glory. But bless his heart. I'm also Southern. Bless his heart. Jerome meant well. He meant that Moses had power, right, and authority, because horns represent power and authority. So we'll give it to him. But anyway, so we have this sort of revelation of attributes of merciful and just, and you have God appearing to Moses, because Moses wants to see him in a particular way, kind of like a king. And like kings, and that's kind of an idea, like kings would often walk by and they'd have callers out describing exactly what sort of, we might even say propaganda, what sort of image that God wanted to be projecting on himself. So he has announced, as God is passing before Moses, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. It's a scary, cool sort of God. This is a God that has love, that is both loving, doesn't want to see people hurt or killed or anything, but in some ways is loving enough to know that when things get bad and when people are hurt, you don't just ignore it. And if people are unrepentant, you don't ignore that either. Because it hurts other people, right? So this is a God who has within himself a kind of walking what is perceived by human beings contradiction. But in God, somehow these two things that seem contradictory coincide and are one. This is the God of the Bible. This is the God, the kind of God that is depicted and understood and understood by the Hebrew people when Jesus comes to earth and preaches as a Jewish man. We will talk next week a bit about Plato and Plato's God and how it is that he came to, through reason, to come to an idea of there not being many gods, like you see in Homer, but one God, who is also good. But before, we have about 5 minutes, and are there any questions? Are there any comments?
it's interesting in the context of moving from Jewish tradition to a Jewish Hellenist tradition, and then to the Christian tradition, how a lot of this interchanges and is interpreted in the New Testament, for example, because if we can hold on the issue of Satan, where Satan is a perfect being, second only to God, and he subverts creation, and he's glorified in pride causes in the fall, in the same way Satan subverts creation, and that's why in Revelation, then he uses the fact of Satan.
What's your name?
Travis.
Travis has made an observation, which I think is a good one, that in the New Testament you see a kind of interpretation of the Genesis 3 account of the snake. Now, as I pointed out, the snake, we don't really know who he is, but we have certain other passages in the prophets that seem to suggest that there's this being, Satan, which means adversary, an angel of light that falls. And thus in the book of Revelation, we have the snake, that great serpent, being interpreted as Satan. And that's very true. The Christian, and in many respects, the New Testament may be seen as a commentary or interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. Any other comments or questions? Go ahead. What's your name?
Daniel.
Daniel.
I heard a commentary about Yahweh, and I'm not an expert, so I'm asking you. I don't really know. But I've heard that the way it's written, the way it's pronounced, kind of like breath noises, and that a possible kind of definition, I guess you said there's multi-definitions, there's like a multi-layered kind of word, but it could kind of be something like breath.
Yeah, there's a lot you can do with this, especially because the Hebrew language, there's a lot of metaphor that can be encapsulated within it. All of these, you notice, are consonants, but we don't have necessarily the vowels that to supply them with, and that's kind of this idea that God may be that kind of breath between the vowels. It's a very Jewish way of looking at it. Any other kind of comments or questions? Okay.
About the word of Moses, it's actually a with a statue created by my 10-year-old.
Yeah, that's the one you're doing on this all that. Oh, we didn't introduce it. Go ahead, Travis.
I am who I am. Wouldn't that follow on when Aquinas' theory of consistency, where God is God's purpose, God's function is just to be, whose function, whose very purpose is to be. Be the same context to find out who I am.
Yes. I mean, that Thomas Aquinas, who's a medieval theologian, would definitely have been thinking about being from this text. Go ahead, what's your name?
David.
David.
So, assuming you don't believe in God, would this be like a shift psychologically that like, if God is the truth, that like the truth is almost contradictory to itself? Like before you had all these gods that were kind of one thing, this is the God of this, but to say that what is real, what is God, is kind of contradicts this way of loving it. Because to me, I don't really believe in God, but you know.
No, that's a really, really good question, and I hope you, when you're reading the Plato reading for next time, consider this, because Plato, one of the reasons he comes up with the idea of there being one God is the fact that he doesn't like the way that the panoply of the Greek gods are just at war with one another. It would seem that if there is a God, that he's going to be at one with himself. Now, to be fair, within even that Platonist tradition, there's this idea that in the realm of the particular, certain things are contradictory that are not contradictory in the realm of the above. For example, the idea of cats. Within the idea of cat, you can have black and white. And we're not talking speckled, but an absolutely black cat and an absolutely white cat. That's in the realm of ideas. But in the realm of particulars, you can only have black and white cats. And so there will be this concept that the things that are in a particular realm are actually have coincidence. A guy named Nicholas of Cuso on Learned Ignorance might be someone you
interested in a Renaissance philosopher for his kind of